You might think of Australia as an ancient, isolated island, a land of kangaroos and vast, empty deserts. But the story etched into its rocks, landscapes, and cultures is far more complex and surprising than the popular image suggests. From supercontinents and ice ages to the world's oldest living cultures, the real history of Australia challenges many of our assumptions. Let's look at the evidence. Australia didn't start as an island. You probably think it has always been a lone continent, adrift in the Southern Ocean. The evidence, however, tells a different story. Geological analysis and plate tectonic mapping show that Australia was once a central piece of Gondwana, a colossal supercontinent that connected it with Antarctica, South America, Africa, and India. This landmass began to fracture around 180 million years ago, but Australia remained fused to Antarctica for millions of years more. It wasn't until approximately 45 million years ago that it finally broke away, beginning its long, slow drift northward into the warmer latitudes we know today. When you picture Uluru, you might see it as a giant, isolated rock, a simple geological wonder. But Uluru isn't merely a landmark, it's a living cultural landscape. For the local Anangu people, its caves, waterholes, and distinctive fissures are chapters in a sacred story, a physical manifestation of their ancestral beings and laws. This is the Chukurpa, the foundation of their culture. Geologically, you may have heard it's a volcanic plug, but that's a common myth. It is, in fact, an Inselberg, literally an island mountain made of sandstone. It represents the remnant of an ancient mountain range that has been slowly eroding for hundreds of millions of years, its true scale hidden with most of its bulk lying beneath the desert sands. Human history, you might believe, truly began with the rise of cities, agriculture, and writing. But long before any of that, a continuous cultural story was already unfolding in Australia. Archaeological evidence from sites like Majid Bebe in Arnhem Land has uncovered stone tools and other artifacts dating back at least 65,000 years. This makes Aboriginal Australian cultures the oldest continuously surviving human cultures known on Earth. Their history is not written in books, but in the land itself, in oral traditions, and in a complex system of kinship and knowledge passed down through more than 2,000 generations. The familiar coastline of Australia, with its famous beaches and harbors, is a relatively recent feature. You probably assume its shape has been static for millennia. Evidence shows, however, that during the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were up to 125 meters lower than they are today. This exposed vast coastal plains, connecting what are now islands to the mainland and extending the continent's edge hundreds of kilometers farther out to sea. These now submerged landscapes were not empty. They were inhabited by people and home to unique ecosystems, a lost world that archaeologists are just beginning to explore with underwater technology. The Great Barrier Reef is often presented as a single, timeless, and ancient structure. The reef you see today, however, is much younger than you might think. While reefs have existed in the region for millions of years, the modern Great Barrier Reef only began to form around 8,000 years ago after the end of the last ice age. As sea levels rose and flooded the continental shelf, conditions became ideal for coral growth. The reef is not a static monolith, but a dynamic system that has grown, collapsed, and reformed multiple times over millennia in response to dramatic shifts in sea level and climate. There's a popular myth that Australia's unique wildlife evolved in complete isolation, a kind of biological island cut off from the rest of the world. But fossil and genetic evidence tells a more connected story. For millions of years, Australia's northward drift brought it closer to Southeast Asia. During periods of low sea level, ancient land bridges and a process known as island hopping allowed for the exchange of species. Rodents, for instance, arrived in multiple waves, and even the ancestors of some songbirds made their way to Australia from other continents, challenging the idea of a purely separate evolutionary path. Tasmania appears today as a distinct island, separated from the mainland by the rough waters of the Bass Strait. But it wasn't always this way. Tasmania used to be a peninsula of mainland Australia. During the lower sea levels of the Ice Age, a broad land bridge known as the Bassian Plain connected the two land masses. This plain, now submerged, was a vast, cold, and windswept tundra that allowed animals and the first human inhabitants to move freely south into what is now Tasmania. When the ice melted and the seas rose around 12,000 years ago, that connection was severed, isolating the island's human and animal populations. The kangaroos and wombats of today are impressive, but their ancient relatives were truly immense. You might think Australia's wildlife has always been its current size. The fossil record, however, reveals a continent once roamed by megafauna, a term for exceptionally large animals. This included Diprotodon, a rhino-sized wombat relative, giant kangaroos standing over 2 meters tall, and massive flightless birds like Genyornis. The extinction of these giants around 40,000 years ago remains a topic of intense scientific debate, with evidence pointing to a combination of a changing climate and the arrival of humans, whose hunting and land management practices altered the ecosystem. The Australian outback is often depicted as a vast, empty wilderness, a void in the heart of the continent. But to see it as empty is to overlook a deep and rich history. This landscape is crisscrossed with ancient trade routes, dotted with sacred rock art galleries thousands of years old, and filled with archaeological sites that provide evidence of long-term human occupation and sophisticated land management. Rather than an untouched wilderness, the outback is a cultural landscape shaped and maintained by indigenous peoples for millennia. You might look at Australia's verdant coasts and think it's a fertile land, but in reality, its soils are among the oldest and most nutrient-poor on the planet. Unlike regions in the northern hemisphere that were revitalized by recent glacial activity, much of the Australian continent has been geologically stable and exposed to weathering for hundreds of millions of years. This process has leached away essential nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, profoundly shaping the evolution of its unique flora and fauna and posing significant challenges for agriculture, both ancient and modern. Today's sprawling cities like Sydney and Melbourne might seem like entirely modern creations, but many of their most important roads and central locations follow ancient contours. Evidence suggests that many modern urban networks are built directly on top of pre-existing indigenous pathways, seasonal camps, and ceremonial grounds. These sites were often situated in strategic locations with access to fresh water and resources. The highways we drive today may, in fact, be tracing routes of travel and trade that are thousands of years old. Bushfires are often framed as a recent crisis. The truth is, fire has been an integral part of the Australian landscape for millions of years, long before any humans arrived. Furthermore, Indigenous Australians developed sophisticated fire management techniques, using controlled, low-intensity burns for tens of thousands of years. This practice, known as cultural burning, helped prevent catastrophic wildfires, promoted biodiversity, and managed resources. While climate change and modern land use policies have increased the frequency and intensity of destructive fires, the presence of fire itself is not new. Its management has simply changed. The story of the Tasmanian tiger, or thylacine, is often told as a sad but inevitable extinction, but its disappearance was a direct result of human actions. The last known thylacine didn't die in the wild. It died from neglect in a Hobart zoo in 1936. For decades prior, the species was systematically hunted due to a government-sponsored bounty scheme, fueled by the mistaken belief that it was a major threat to livestock. Combined with habitat loss and potential disease, this pressure drove a once widespread predator to extinction, a modern tragedy that evidence shows was entirely preventable. You might think of Australia's identity as being forged primarily through its British colonial origins or its military history, but perhaps no single event reshaped the nation faster or more profoundly than the gold rushes of the 19th century. Beginning in the 1850s, the discovery of gold in Victoria and New South Wales triggered one of the largest global migrations of the era. The population boomed, wealth poured in, and cities like Melbourne grew almost overnight from small towns into grand metropolises. This period of intense economic growth and social change fundamentally altered Australia's demography and set the stage for its future as a multicultural nation. The climate and life of a continent as large as Australia might seem to be determined by the land itself, but its fate is inextricably tied to the ocean. Major ocean currents, such as the warm East Australian Current and the cooler Leeuwin Current, act as colossal engines, transporting heat, nutrients, and marine life around the continent. These currents influence everything from rainfall patterns on the coast to the health of the Great Barrier Reef and the distribution of biodiversity in the nation's fisheries. In Australia, the ocean often decides. When you think of Australia, snow is probably the last thing that comes to mind. But the continent has its own alpine regions. The Australian Alps, spanning parts of New South Wales and Victoria, receive regular and significant snowfall, supporting ski resorts and unique alpine ecosystems. These high-altitude environments are home to specialized plants and animals found nowhere else and preserve geological evidence of past glaciations, a reminder of the continent's diverse and changing climate. Australia is often perceived as culturally monolithic, but before 1788, it was one of the most linguistically diverse regions on Earth. It's a common misconception that there was a single Aboriginal language. In fact, over 250 distinct languages were spoken across the continent, many with multiple dialects, reflecting a deep and complex tapestry of cultures. Colonization, forced relocation, and assimilation policies led to the tragic loss of many of these languages, though today there are powerful and determined efforts by indigenous communities to revive and maintain their linguistic heritage. The arrival of Captain Cook and the British First Fleet is often taught as Australia's first significant contact with the outside world, but evidence from the north tells a different story. For centuries before European colonization, Macassan traders from what is now Indonesia made regular voyages to the shores of northern Australia. They came in search of trepang, or sea cucumber, and established long-term trading relationships with local Yolngu communities. This interaction led to cultural and linguistic exchange, evidence of which can still be seen today in the art, language, and stories of the region. With its vast, sparsely populated outback, Australia is often thought of as a country of wide-open spaces. But this image is misleading. Australia is actually one of the most highly urbanized nations in the world. Over 85% of its population lives in urban areas, and the vast majority of those cities and towns are clustered along the coast. The quintessential outback life is the reality for only a tiny fraction of Australians, whose daily lives are far more likely to be shaped by cityscapes than by desert landscapes. Australia's global influence extends all the way to the South Pole. You might not associate the sunburnt country with the icy expanse of Antarctica. However, Australia governs a larger portion of Antarctica than any other nation and plays a critical role in polar science. It maintains several permanent research stations, conducting vital research into climate change through ice core drilling, studying unique ecosystems, and monitoring the health of the Antarctic continent. This scientific work provides crucial data for understanding the past and future of our planet's climate. If one thing's clear, it's this: Australia's story is bigger and stranger than the headlines. Sources and further reading are in the end card and pinned comment. If you learned something new, like, subscribe, and tell us which fact surprised you most, we'll explore it next. Thanks for watching.